All right. Good morning, everyone. I've got 10 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and jump in and get started. We do have a pretty good agenda for you guys today. So just a few housekeeping things. Please place your questions in the chat. If you guys do have any, we will hopefully have time at the very end to allow for some Q&A. Also, please be mindful to mute yourself as we are going through the meeting. So you guys do have the ability to be able to come off of mute and join in the conversation too. So we will have some questions throughout the presentation. And we definitely want this to be a discussion. And we want to hear your guys' input. So feel free to unmute yourself or put anything in the chat, and we will be monitoring that as we go along today's discussion. Other than that, I think we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. David, I see your question there in the chat. It will be recorded, yes. So we will plan on recording this and posting this onto our Connecting All Missourians page. So if you would like to share or go back and rewatch, you can definitely feel free to do so. And I think, Adam, we will be able to share our slideshow with you guys too, if I'm not mistaken. So we will definitely have that available for you all. First and foremost, just want to thank you guys all for attending today's call. We know we do have it scheduled for 2 hours, so we may or may not need that whole time, but we wanted to make sure that we have it allotted. That way, if you guys do have questions and we have some good discussion going, we don't want to cut that off. So first, we do have a guest speaker for you guys today. I would like to introduce Randy Norden. He is with Missouri 811. And he will be giving you guys just some brief information and some updates from his end. And feel free, if you guys have questions after he does present, we can take a few minutes and allow for that too. And so let me see, Randy, are you on?
I'm here.
All right, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to Missouri Department of Economic Development and providing me this opportunity to connect with existing and potentially new internet service providers regarding your activity in Missouri. So I won't take up too much time. You have a lot of subject matter to cover, but what I did want to talk about today is if you're an existing ISP, you're probably already aware, but if you happen to be a potential new one coming into Missouri, as a owner of underground utility, you will be required to become a member of Missouri 811 by statute, and that will require us to develop you as a member, create your mapping, your notification mapping to where as excavators do excavation requests in Missouri, then we'll be able to notify you to be able to mark your utilities. So I definitely wanted to remind everybody of their legal responsibilities with Statute 319 in that respect and connecting with us. And the second thing is, as you are creating new infrastructure in the ground and updating, we want to work with you to update your mapping, your notification mapping, so that as you get new infrastructure in the ground, that our notification maps are matching your new activities so that we can ensure that your underground infrastructure is being acknowledged in all applicable excavation requests. The other thing that I would like to present to everybody is, I know as we move along and you may receive financing for upcoming projects, and you may have no idea at all who is going to be your contractor. You may be doing your work in-house, or you may be hiring contractors to do your work, which may even be out-of-state contractors. I would really love the opportunity to connect with your contractors and your crews ahead of time so that one of our damage prevention managers can meet with them and give them the update with the requirements of excavation in Missouri and what to expect with regard to how to excavate, how to pothole, and as well as any potential issues we may be collectively facing with locating underground infrastructure. So you can, if you have any questions at all, you can reach me at any time by contacting me at my email address, rnorden at Missouri-811.org, or you can go to Missouri811.org and you'll see an About Us page with the contact information there. That is the general connection I wanted to make with everybody today, and appreciate Stephanie. And I don't know if you want to open up to any questions at this point, but I'm happy to address any.
So, and I should say I'm Adam Thorpe. I'm the Community Development Specialist at the Office of Broadband Development. I'm going to be presenting some of the information later in the slide. I did have a few questions I wanted to ask, and then I did want to open it up if you're willing, if anybody here has questions. I guess just generally speaking, what are sort of best practices? So we're going to potentially have lots of projects coming in at a really big scale all across the state. As we ramp up different broadband programming, I guess what are sort of best practices in terms of working with 811 when a big project is coming into an area? Are there ways that we can plan things out ahead of time, coordinate things to reduce the burden on you and make sure people get the information they need in a timely way?
Yes, they are. And thank you, Adam. You know, definitely looking back to 2022 when there was a lot of broadband and fiber activity, definitely the ISPs were hesitant to let the notification center know ahead of time where they plan to work due to proprietary concerns of not wanting to divulge information which may get leaked out to competitors. One connection I've made with the Department of Economic Development is they have some GIS mapping of the potential projects and some general timelines. So we'll be integrating some of that mapping into ours through the notification center and be able to give other utilities a heads up kind of when some work is intended on being done. Somewhat of a weather forecast, if you could think of it in that sense. And so that would allow the opportunity for the other utilities to be prepared for this work coming. An example, in 2022, there were areas where contractors descended on a focused area and the locators were not prepared for it. An exact example that comes to mind is Johnson County and Pettis County, where contractors settled in those areas laying broadband, and USIC, which is a very common third-party locator, has one person assigned to those two counties. And you have smaller communities, smaller municipalities and such that may have just one person who has been properly trained to perform the locates. So it's coordinating with the existing utilities and coordinating with the contractors. And the mechanism we found that worked well last year is to make sure that when we see this work coming in, we encourage this networking between the existing utilities and the contractors so that the contractors can move along in a timely fashion, and that the locates are working along with the contractors to ensure that the locates are happening ahead of the work schedule.
I appreciate it. That's great content and some good context about what things looked like this last year. I guess I did want to open it up at this point if anybody had any particular questions or thoughts about this particular sort of potential limiting factor on getting these projects underway. I'll open it up now.
I see there was a chat question from Derek. What is Missouri 811 doing to encourage your members to comply with the legal requirements to mark utilities? Broadband projects are sometimes delayed because utilities don't fulfill their legal obligation to mark and status. And yes, that goes back to the old problem that seems to have been around for a while about, particularly in some geographical areas where a lot of work is being placed and then the locators are not keeping up with the work. Definitely we've coordinated with the third-party locators and encourage them to improve their situation. I know USIC is postured much better than they were 1 year ago. Of course, naturally, I have no authority to force them to do anything. As Missouri 811, the notification center, I'm not a regulatory agency. I am not an enforcement agency, and I have no direct authority to require anyone to do anything. but definitely getting out the word to our membership. And one of the efforts is, of course, is working with Department of Economic Development to find out where the work is generally going to occur and try to give the membership a heads up ahead of time of what's coming so that they can be better prepared, as well as some of the situations with late locates. Late locates are a problem, not only in Missouri, but nationwide. And partnering with Association of General Contractors, Missouri Side Association, and Missouri LICA as well this summer and fall, to where we can create some legislative changes, which we hope will help create a ticketing process that will alleviate some of the inability of locates not being able to keep up with excavation work.
Unless there was anything else, I want to thank you for your time. I think this was helpful, and hopefully this has also given people a name and a face if they have questions, then they want to follow up on. Really do appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I saw there was another one.
I apologize.
Question about, just trying to see it in there. What about the utility that will just not locate our local projects? We have two in particular. The best thing I can do on that is if you have a utility that's not providing service, contact us. And usually through our damage prevention managers, we can make some specific incidences clear up very quickly. It's usually a misunderstanding or some kind of issue that's going on in a given area. The other thing that I would suggest is that as excavators, for those of you who may be involved in excavating, have a problem with locates, file a complaint with the Attorney General. Now, I know there seems to be an open comment and an open reality that the Office of the Attorney General has resisted following up on complaints filed against utilities. But I would encourage the excavators to continue to file those complaints, because if the complaints are not filed, then there is not going to be a record of them to respond to begin with. So we'll be looking to create some templates for the excavators to do some of the common complaints to file against utilities. Those will be up on our website soon, and I encourage you to do those as well.
All right.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Yep. Thank you, Randy. We appreciate your time this morning, guys. And like you said, if there are any other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to him. Him and his team are more than happy to touch base with you guys and answer those questions there. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Adam, who is our community development specialist. And he is got some slides he's going to present on and some questions that we'll have. So feel free, like I said, to drop any of those questions in the chat as we move along, and we will get to them at the end. Adam, the floor is yours.
Oh, so I'd actually like to encourage people, if you're able to drop your name and affiliation in the chat, just so we can have a record and some sense of who's here. Appreciate everybody coming out today. I think some of this information may be a little remedial, and some of this information is kind of forward-looking in the sense that things are going to be subject to change as we get future guidance and as our program and our thinking develops. My thought here in terms of the information I'm presenting is to try to give you a sense of the lay of the land as we see it right now, and then hopefully hear from you where sensitivities are. How can we design this program to maximize the number of people who get service, to minimize unnecessary delays and hassles. We have some time now to plan this all out and think through what approach makes sense. And so this is part of that process. So there'll be some times I'll be asking questions, and I hope I can get some input, and we'll also be open to questions as you have them about the information we present. There just may be some cases where we ask for some time to track down an answer to a particular question. This information has been out there for a while, but just for context for people, this is kind of a very rough timeline of where things stand. Near the end of June, we'll learn the exact amount of money that the state of Missouri will receive, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's going to be determined. But it's going to be a big opportunity for the state. It's going to come to us in 2 rounds. will submit an initial proposal to receive the first 20% of that funding. That initial proposal is the due date is in December. Before that, we'll submit a 5-year plan, which is due near the end of August. That lays out our sort of big picture plan for addressing the problem of people without internet access. The initial proposal, once it's approved, releases the first 20% of the funding. Within a year of that date, we submit our final proposal and get the remaining 80%. Our hope is to accelerate this process. We want to get these projects underway as quickly as possible. We hope to submit substantially ahead of that deadline. But we want people to understand that there are different factors at play there, not all within our office. So we'll be trying to move expeditiously on these issues. For anybody not familiar, this lays out the math governing the amount each state's going to receive in BEAD funding. Just, based on that first, the first release of the FCC broadband map, the state of Missouri had about 4% of unserved locations across the country, and potentially a larger share of those high-cost unserved locations. And as a general note, BEAD funding is based on the number of unserved locations, because it can be used to serve underserved locations as well. States with a high ratio of underserved to unserved locations are going to be trying to cover more locations with less funding. Missouri actually has it's a relatively high number of unserved locations compared to its number of underserved locations. There's basically roughly two unserved locations for every underserved location. Nationwide, that ratio is a little closer to 1-to-1. So at least in that kind of particular area, Missouri may be well situated. In the first instance, eligibility determinations for BEAD begin with the Federal Communications Map of broadband service as it stands at the time that we carry out these determinations. So we'll be using the most up-to-date map available. NTIA has indicated to us that the map's going to be definitive when it comes to the universe of broadband serviceable locations. So through our state challenge process, which we'll discuss further, we'll be able to consider whether a location should be served or unserved. And we may be able to make some determinations there that go beyond what's on the FCC map. But we won't be able to add locations outside of the location challenge process operated by CostQuest and the FCC. So the location will need to be marked as a broadband serviceable location on the FCC map to receive funding under the program. We're reaching out to county governments and different units of government to try to file challenges from our office to continue adding locations to the map through a bulk challenge process. I'll also note, providers are on the ground in these communities. You may have records of where locations exist in these communities, and you can file bulk challenges. We'd be happy to talk to you about that process. I guess I did want to ask, and I think people could feel free to come off mute, but I don't know if anybody has filed, has gone through that process and is able to share anything about what that looked like. And we will address the questions that are coming up in the chat. Probably before we get to the end of the presentation, I just want to move through the small set of slides here before we shift to that. But I appreciate that people are engaged. After we've taken those unserved, underserved locations in the from the FCC map, we need to block out areas that are already set to receive broadband service through state and federal broadband programs. You can see the programs that account for a lot of these areas on the screen here. The sort of not particularly detailed maps, but you can get a sense. Lots of geography covered. In some parts of the state, this really totally changes the picture. There are lots of unserved and underserved locations, but a lot of them are accounted for at least we hope, by these projects. And that makes the goals of the BEAD program more achievable. You know, if we were trying to reach every location, regardless of that existing funding, it would be a much bigger challenge. On the other hand, we want to make sure that we're not proceeding on the assumption that areas get service through these programs. If for whatever reason that's not going to happen. We're going to try to work with the most current possible data on the status of these projects in order to make sure that we can identify projects that aren't going forward for whatever reason. There's also a kind of particular case that we are going to be required to document. There are some projects that aren't required to serve every location in a given project area. In situations where the number of locations they committed to serve at the when the grant was awarded doesn't equal the number of locations in the area, we're going to have to look for those cases and identify through our challenge process where those locations that aren't going to get served, where they sit, and so we can open them up for funding. But you know, the goal will be to take account of these programs while making sure that process doesn't leave anybody out of the BEAD process when they're going to need service. So if you based on, you know, if we exclude unserved locations from the FCC map and unserved locations, we get a map. I apologize. We get a map that looks like this. Of course, the whole picture is going to change when we get another round, the next round of FCC maps. We further modified through the state challenge process. At the end of the day, you get something like this. You get a sort of checkerboard of unserved and underserved locations, that's sort of represented in yellow here, that are potentially fundable. These light green areas are areas where there is some sort of existing funding commitment. And then you get green served areas. If we just jump back onto our slide here, you know, if you do the math here, we get about 300,000 BEAD eligible locations based on that version of the map, and those accounts of funded projects. So that's sort of the goal. We're going to try to get to all of those locations. There are also some kind of special cases that will be being a relatively small set of eligible locations that are not captured by the FCC map. Internet service to community anchor institutions, schools, libraries, so forth. They're not generally captured on this map, but we're going to be required to identify those locations and identify the locations that have less than 1 gigabit per second symmetrical speeds. And if we submit a plan that NTIA believes can reach all unserved and underserved locations, getting community anchor institutions below those speeds up to that level would be an eligible use of BEAD funds. We're beginning to roll out the digital asset map, which is a part of our broader IIJA planning efforts. That basically, you know, we're asking people to submit information if they provide services that help people get online. And as part of that process, we're hoping to begin collecting information about internet speeds, trying to identify providers that are below that level. The other case is sort of multi-unit buildings where service to the curb, but no without broadband level service to some units within the building. The NTIA has indicated that those would be they would fit into that kind of unserved category in terms of prioritization for the program. And they've indicated that they plan to provide some guidance on exactly how we can identify those buildings. I think we would need some clarification on conceptually what they mean, what's meant by unserved units within a building with service to the curb, but we would want to try to identify those if we end up being able to fund service to those buildings. There are also, we have a legislative mandate to collect some information from participants in our grants program. There are some instances in which data from providers might help us accelerate and improve our mapping process. We're going to need to find some way of gathering information about funded projects that aren't required to reach 100% of their locations, like we discussed earlier. And we're going to want to try to be as up to date as possible on the status of other funded projects. We also hope to begin collecting information submitted to the FCC through their broadband data collection, and hopefully kind of reduce the lag in terms of the mapping process from the submission of that data to when the FCC is ready to update their maps. So you should expect to hear more from us on this point as we proceed into the creation of our Missouri broadband access map. We're hoping to improve on the FCC maps here, hoping to address some of the challenges. The contractor that we're hoping to bring on to work on creating this map has some ability to conduct verification, checking that infrastructure is the infrastructure actually on the ground lines up with what we're seeing on the map, making things that making sure things make sense. Until we finalize the details of the project with our partner, we won't know exactly what this will look like, but the goal will be to put forward a map reflecting the best available data that we can get, and then integrate it into our state challenge process. That process looks a little different than for people who participated, for instance, in the challenge process around ARPA. NTIA is asking us to define the universe of eligible locations ahead of time. So we'll make determinations as we create the MBAM. We'll make determinations about the eligibility of given locations. And then we'll allow challenges of these locations. That will then allow us to seek proposals for projects with some confidence that about what locations people should be looking to serve. We'll define the universe of servable locations and then ask for proposals that reach those locations. NTIA's guidance is challenges allowed from nonprofits, from local governments, from ISPs to determinations in this process. They have indicated that one of the differences between this and the challenge process around the FCC is the use of speed tests. They've also indicated that this is going to be that they are going to have they have a certain point of view in terms of what makes sense to accept as a speed test for submission to these as successful challenges. And we expect further guidance in terms of exactly what they're looking for there. And we will also have a relationship with the contractor that put together MBAM, and we may be able to conduct sort of verification to resolve instances where there is where there's sort of an unresolved question about the status of service at a particular location. Those challenges come to us, we'll make our determinations, and then if a challenge is successful, it goes to NTIA for review. So we won't be sort of the final word here, but hopefully as this process works out, we'll get a more refined sense of where exactly service needs to go. So I guess I was hoping we could start by maybe just going through the questions that have been popped in the chat. Stephanie, are you able to read those off with my screen shared? I don't have a great view of the chat.
Yep, absolutely. Let me scroll back up to the top. All right, first question we have is there a process documented with detail of mapping updates how and when the update should be submitted.
And I don't know if the person who asked that question can sort of chime in to talk about what map we're sort of discussing there. In terms of the mapping process for our office, until we finalized our relationship with our partner who's going to be working on the map production for us, we won't have fine details there. ISPs are hopefully engaged with the FCC's process, which is collects information on sort of every 6-month period. I do think people are beginning to realize that the map is actually, the actual FCC map is updated on a higher frequency than that, as challenges are resolved. And I think there have been some instances where late coming providers came in, and there actually have been some, I think not huge in terms of numbers changes from Missouri. I think a net change of less than 1,000 locations since the FCC, in terms of the number of unserved locations since the FCC map was published. But you know, that map, it seems like every 2 weeks or so, there are some changes to that map. But I think data submission should be on that 6-month period.
Great, thank you. Next one is, when will the Office of Broadband submit its plan to NTIA? So Jared, I'll answer that question to the point there. So our 5-year action plan is due at the end of August to NTIA. And then if you have questions about the initial proposal, that is actually due 180 days after we find out what our allocation is, but plan on submitting that at an earlier rate as well. So that's kind of the time frame that we are looking at for submission of plans to NTIA. And then the next question we do have is, will ISPs need an ILOC for BEAD funding? I don't know, Adam, do you know that question?
Yeah, we will be discussing this later. There is a letter of credit requirement. And I hope I am interpreting that acronym correctly. But yes, there is a letter of credit requirement. I'd encourage people to look at the NOFO for kind of more precise details. And we will provide further guidance from our office. But yes, there is a letter of credit requirement. And you can, and that's why I can say about that right now.
Great, thank you. Will stakeholders have an opportunity to review and provide comment on the plan before it is submitted to NTIA?
Yes, so both in the structure of our challenge process and in the sort of overall initial proposal, there will be an opportunity to provide comment. You can imagine we'll be somewhat similar to, I think it would, use some of the same channels for providing comment that we've used, for instance, for our programs.
Next question. Are you saying that if we can show a location is not served, the state will not fund it through BEAD unless we prove it through the FCC first? And I think this one was back when we were discussing the locations.
Yes, and that's an important distinction, and the term broadband serviceable location can be a little misleading on this point. So when I say that it needs to be on the map, I'm talking about the address needs to be on the map. We'll be able to consider evidence that a location is unserved, but NTIA has indicated we won't be able to put a new location on the map. So to put in very simple terms, the color of the dot, we may be able to do something about the specific level of service, but they're indicating that they want the dot to be there. There's a location at this address that's broadband serviceable, and broadband serviceable, they mean in the market for mass market broadband, generally not a large institution that subscribed to some sort of bespoke product or some sort of consortium buying, but someone who would call up a provider and try to get service. They should be on the map and marked as such if we're going to be able to fund it. And you should let me know if that's still not clear, but we're all trying to figure this out together.
And the next question is, does your RDOF funded results include LTD considering they have defaulted? So I believe this was back when you were showing those maps.
Yes, the version of the map I was working on does include those very big defaults, including LTD. Those maps are now a couple months old, and if there have been updates to the FCC map before then, since then, we can sort of, it captures those big changes. It doesn't include LTD funded locations. I think that any changes, we may need to update those numbers, but and we'll use the most recent version of the map. But generally speaking, I think it puts us in the ballpark in terms of the number of locations covered.
I have one more question at this point in time. Is there a way to distinguish between areas where speed is not as promised and areas where providers say they are providing service, but when an end user asks, they say service is not available?
So we're going to get guidance from NTIA about exactly what they will sign off on in terms of speed tests and other ways of kind of documenting gaps between the service advertised and the service offered. And certainly that is feedback we get a lot when we're talking to members of the public in terms of the FCC maps as a source of frustration, that the FCC maps doesn't really allow challenges on those grounds. So there should be an opportunity here to kind of get into that question. And that should be one of the advantages offered by the state challenge process. Now, exactly what that looks like, we need to know more from the federal government. But we'll be looking for opportunities to kind of get into those questions.
Great, thanks, Adam. That looks like the last question that we do have in the chat at this point in time. So if we want to kind of move on to our discussion questions here, I think we can do so.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to start by getting a sense. We've now had a little bit of time to sit with the FCC maps. And I guess I'm wondering what people's sort of overall impressions are. If you have a sense of whether you think it kind of relatively fairly represents the areas you operate in. And also kind of what, if anything, you expect to change. This can help us sort of calibrate what we should be, how much change we should be expecting to see on these maps as we try to figure out the final set of locations.
Adam, this is Andrew with Show Me Technologies. I'll just make the comment. I still think that a lot of it is overstated from some of the providers. And just as an example, for my own home, I had a provider that claimed they serviced me. And so I initiated an individual challenge. And the challenge process through the FCC is difficult at best and really not for every homeowner. I do this on a daily basis, and really it kind of comes down to they almost favor the provider versus the homeowner. And so once I produced my challenge and even provided proof, email proof that they did not serve me, they still contacted that provider and set a 60-day window. And when that window expired, I never heard back from them. So it's really not a great challenge process. And again, like I stated first, I think it's still quite overstated.
Adam, hi, this is Gigi Quinlan McAravey with Cooper County. As you know, I'm working with one community, and now another community has bending my ear. But the one community, you asked me if they ever heard back on their challenges, and I just wanted to let you know they have not. So they don't know what's going on.
And, that we can sort of dig into that further. It may make sense if we group offline on that question. It is, people should be hearing back. I think there have been people I was in contact with as we worked with people through the challenge process who have gotten service overturned through that process. So it is having an effect on the map, but I do think the effect's going to be small, just given I think some of the challenges that people ran into navigating that process.
And Adam, I just want to jump in real quick before someone else does too. So we lost the PowerPoint, so you may want to pull the PowerPoint back up with those questions that you had.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I guess I was also hoping to sort of get a sense, maybe starting specifically with this question of projects that aren't 100% served, and people in that category, including I think some CAF projects where there may be more locations than were allocated to the area when the project was awarded. If we were to ask people to identify the particular locations in that area that they plan to serve, is that something that's sort of within the capability in terms of where planning is on those projects? Do people? I just like to get a sense of what's reasonable to request, because we need to get some sort of answer to this question.
Adam, this is Lloyd Rice at SEMO. I just had a conversation yesterday with a regional planning commission where some CAF winners, wireless in particular, for the most part, say they're going to put fiber in. There's no indication that that's really their technology that makes sense for them. And there are some really small pockets that make contiguousness nearly impossible to finish. BJ and I have talked about this. It's going to be a real conundrum to put these areas together without maybe I don't know, is it fair to ask for a timeline on CAF projects? I know what the requirements are, we too are requiring, but short of calling out a particular provider, especially with CAF dollars, that could really block some very specific areas. I know down here in the southeast part, some really big ones that we would in turn specifically bid on.
And that sort of speaks to the issue we're trying to understand here. We'd like to be able to identify those locations that aren't coming through for whatever reason, and to some extent without any judgment on it, just because we don't want to make sure that we don't lose out on those areas, don't get blocked out from BEAD. It should be good news for them that they already have funding lined up, but we just want to make sure it does happen.
Right, that it's not caught in some sort of percentage served equation and it just gets left off for years to come.
I guess I also wanted, from the sort of other side of the FCC process, I don't know if people have any sort of takeaways from the experience as a challenge provider, or just sort of the general trend of how that process worked. If there are things that we could do to make a challenge process that's it's kind of more straightforward, that provides kind of definitive and consistent results. One of my concerns is, we don't want, I think it's inevitable to some extent that the squeaky wheel will get the grease, but we would like communities that aren't super engaged, that don't have these resources, to be able to register if they don't have service. So I don't know if people can have any reflections on what the experience was like responding to challenges. What would be sort of a sound basis for our challenge process?
Yeah, so Adam, this is Charlene White with Unite Private Networks. We provide business grade services and wholesale services, and we had some residential locations that were incorrectly identified as served by us. So we received challenges in another state and went ahead and conceded those challenges. But we also received some challenges for businesses. And with that, it was talking with the broadband office that had submitted the challenge and explaining why we didn't think that was a fair challenge to our service, and showing them the maps. And then they rescinded their challenge.
And do you have a sense of what the process was that led to that challenge being filed? I'd sort of like to know what would be kind of what are some bad roads to go down in terms of roads that will generate kind of false positives. We don't want to waste people's time running after stuff like that if it doesn't make sense.
I didn't really get a good sense from them as to what their thought process was on submitting the challenge. We had kind of tried to explore that a little bit, and they said with it being a new process, they just didn't know what would happen. So they appreciated us as a provider reaching out to them and talking about the challenges before sending a response back, because then that triggers another response window for the challenger, I think.
I guess I'll just, I appreciate that notes about that experience. I guess I'll just open this up. Does anybody have any thoughts on these questions, on ways we can design this mapping process to really get at the actual situation in the state?
Hi, my name is Catherine Hunter. I'm from Casinger. I just wanted to kind of point out something that I noticed, that some people had complained that there was a lot of personal information required, at least by the FCC's challenge process, and that might be a turnoff for some people as far as doing the challenge, that they were being required to give a lot of information and a lot of personal information as well.
I appreciate that. And, there are obviously different kind of equities that have to be balanced there in terms of giving people a chance to respond. But I think that's certainly a concern we heard as well. So we can think about how we can try to make that ask for the information that we need and not anything further. Unless there's anything else, I am going to shift sort of into our next section here. So once we have this sort of universe of locations, we're going to need to pick where projects end up going. A point I think is going to be an important point for us to determine is the question of what the notice of funding opportunity calls the extremely high cost threshold, above which we can consider more affordable non-fiber to the premises solutions. So we'll be getting some additional data through a license that NTIA is arranging to get some modeling about what they think sort of reasonable costs for projects are. And we'll be able to get a sense, once we have our final allocation and a more refined sense of the number of remaining locations, we'll get a sense of the number we want to hit overall. You can think there may be a point at which we say projects over a certain level, we can only have so many of them before we're not going to be able to reach the number of people that we want to reach. So we'll be trying to sort of balance those factors in terms of setting this threshold. We're supposed to be getting more communication from NTIA about how we make that decision. I think this gets to the point that Lloyd brought up earlier about some of these project areas, the difficulty of producing sort of contiguous project areas. These are just a few kind of interesting patterns of reporting that you see in some different parts of the state. So in the first slide here, we've got this, and here, red, yellow generally being unserved or underserved and unfunded, light green being unserved and underserved but funded, and then green or the blocked off green census blocks are all served. So you have this sort of kind of interesting pattern where there's some areas with lots of funded projects in sort of rural areas and small towns that are sort of all unserved or underserved. That maybe is a relatively straightforward situation in terms of thinking about a project. You still have plenty of areas, which is maybe more the pattern you'd expect, which is large unserved areas like we see in that second frame here. And then we do have these, I think, very challenging situations where some mixture of kind of scattered patterns of reported service and scattered awarded projects leaves kind of isolated, unserved locations, presumably really unserved, really probably sort of challenging to get service out to, the sort of location you'd want maybe a project to go to, but it's hard to see how you put together a project that that grabs those spots. We have flexibility in terms of the size of projects. In terms of how we ask for projects. So they, NTI mentions as an example, we could bid out particular geographies and say, get all service in this geography. We could ask for proposals to serve locations. We could ask for people to submit project areas to us, and we just need a plan for sort of what unit we're going to be asking for information about. And we want to avoid making more locations like that third image there. Hopefully we can avoid some of the decisions that lead to those patterns, especially when those locations are generated by funded projects that just aren't comprehensive for a given area. In this, in the rest of this section, I'm going to briefly touch on some of the areas identified in the NOFO around sub-grantee selection. My hope is that by previewing and discussing some of these requirements, we can identify areas of sensitivity, areas where office should work with NTIA and look for areas for flexibility and opportunities to provide additional support. The BEAD program has a lot of requirements, even compared to some other broadband programs. Hopefully, one of the advantages of working through the state government is that we can find solutions that work in Missouri. But this, the fine details about this, the information that we have is mostly also spelled out in the NOFO, but this sort of points forward to some of these areas. After we get past those requirements, we have there's a set of what NTIA is labeled in the NOFO as primary criteria, where we have to give the greatest weight in terms of picking projects. Once we have a project that sort of meets those speed requirements and gets people broadband, as NTIA has defined it, we need to sort of try to minimize the amount that's paid out of BEAD. We need to provide certain measures of affordability and this sort of certification around fair labor practices. And we'll circle around to some of these in just a moment. They also lay out secondary criteria that we must give weight to, but less than those primary criteria. And for that first 20% round in the initial proposal, that includes speed to deployment. I think with the thought of trying to get some of these projects funded with that initial proposal money underway in time to be factored into decisions around the remaining 80%, the speed of the network. And then you can see there are additional factors there. They allow us to consider other factors, and these are some that they highlight as that they recommend. I sort of pulled out some of the details from the NOFO about cybersecurity and supply chain, which is a requirement of the BEAD program, in part because in my understanding, this has not been as much of a feature of previous broadband programs. It's obviously an involved issue. We should receive more guidance on exactly how we can help you meet these requirements. But I just want to sort of preview this element of the program now, because I think it's something that could potentially sneak up on people. A kind of more familiar element of the program to do with project selection and has to do with project selection and
Adam, I think we may have lost your audio.
Generally speaking, NTIA wants us to minimize
Yeah, I'll find out the price.
the amount of money that's coming out of B to fund these projects. Without a waiver from NTIA, they want a 25% match, and they want to incentivize matches above that level. Even if this wasn't a requirement, we need money from outside the program if we're going to reach all the people we want to reach with the amount of money that's available. At the same time, we don't want to discourage good projects in hard to reach locations. When considering incentives for matches above the 25% level, NTIA encourages us to take into account factors that make projects more expensive, but meet other important goals. So scalability, resilience. So this is not the only factor, and there may be situations in which a project that costs a little more makes sense, but we just want to, it has been signaled as an important consideration for NTIA. So, just highlighting that here. Those required elements around affordability include a low cost broadband option for networks built with BEAD, and a plan overall that we'll submit to try to encourage middle class affordability for high-speed internet across the state. So, one of the questions we're trying to answer through this planning process is what do these provisions look like? NOFO says that that factors that they look at in terms of signing off on a low-cost plan would be things like ACP participation, monthly cost of broadband, and the quality of service that you can get for that low-cost option. And then, affordability was also one of the primary criteria when comparing different plans. And what they indicate there is they want us to compare, in terms of that scoring element, the most affordable price for 1 gigabit symmetrical service. This required area in terms of the public notice is required to make sure that consumers are aware of new service that BEAD brings to their area. I grouped the question this with the question of local coordination, which is one of NTIA's suggested additional factors as well. So sometimes a factor in successful ARPA applications. As an office, we just want to know that a given project meets the needs of the community it's going to be serving, and some sign of engagement with local governments can be helpful in giving us that information. And here's a little more detail around the selection factors mentioned in the NOFO around labor standards and workforce. One component of our submission to NTIA will be to lay out how we plan to make sure that there's a healthy, sustainable workforce that's ready to work on these projects, that's sufficient to carry these projects out, and how we deal with these factors, and weighing the scoring of these factors in our project selection will be one element of what NTIA will consider in determining whether they think we have a plan that accomplishes those goals. So if we've had questions in the chat since I last spoke, I'd appreciate, Stephanie, if you could give those to me, and then we can sort of proceed through this set of questions about some of these decisions about project selection.
Yeah, definitely. The next question that we had in there was, how does the NOFO define affordability? And I believe you kind of addressed that after the question came into the chat, but if you would like to address it again, feel free.
And I think, as people have seen on that slide, in terms of that primary criteria, I guess it's relatively straightforward in terms they want to know the cost offered for a particular plan, but there are also elements of that affordability question that we would need to define, including exactly what we're going to consider a low-cost plan, and what measures we're going to take to encourage middle-class affordability, and what exactly we mean by that. So that's going to be an element of our plans. People have a chance to comment on them and provide feedback.
And then the last question we do have at this point is, the Office of Broadband considering a competitive middle mile exclusive offering that would provide middle mile to and underserved communities, giving last mile providers an interconnect resource?
So my understanding of BEAD rules is that a middle mile project unconnected from last mile connections would be difficult for us to fund independently with BEAD. That is my understanding of the rules laid out in the NOFO. My understanding is also that we can fund middle mile in connection to last mile projects. So that is my understanding. Be open to further conversation about that, and if people have thoughts about possibilities there. We did receive applications for NTIA's middle mile program in the state. And I think we're supposed to be receiving information about who was awarded there shortly. But we certainly understand that that's a part of the picture. And we open to thoughts about how that could be incorporated. I guess so, we're going to need to be, as an office, we'll be needing to make determinations about extremely high cost threshold and also just generally what makes sense as a cost for a project in a given location. I guess I'd be interested in input from folks on this call, just kind of broadly, what factors drive cost in a given location? What should we be looking at when we're trying to determine what is a higher cost as opposed to a lower cost location? I guess people should feel free to chime in on that in the chat or circle back around to it. I also wanted to get a sense of people's kind of preference, people's thought about what scale makes sense for project areas. So, we have the option of defining project areas. I don't know, Lloyd, for instance, if you had thoughts about what a good solution to this problem of these kind of isolated locations are, we have some opportunities here to be flexible about how we bid out these projects to try to reach those locations. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Well, I think the office itself is in a unique position to maybe negotiate or ask the hard question. Hey, are you going to serve this area, and what is the time frame? Because I don't think in our case and in most of the folks I know, if we were going to bid on areas, they somewhat have to be contiguous. And even if there is a small, or I'm not small is the wrong word, another provider in, say, a 1, 2, 3 census block area that's just kind of random and out there in the middle of what looks like nowhere, I'm doing air quotes there, to just have that frank discussion. Are you coming? Because we really feel like this portion can't be left out of the holistic area, because contiguous projects are not only important to you guys, but they're important to the ISP on the end of it, because so many times it included the best or the most dense of it, correct? So maybe your office's ability to vet that, or at least not entirely different than the challenge project or process, Adam, but to thoroughly vet that under the guise of, hey, we're really feeling like we need to fund a project. It does include a funded area, but I would hate for these small pockets of funding that have randomly popped up all over at least the southwest portion of the state, to exclude, kind of the greater cause. Because at the end of the day, the greater cause is what this last round of money and the most expensive of it is gonna need to include. And Adam, you look there. You came back. You looked frozen for a second.
No, I'm sorry. I looked like somebody was maybe coming off of mute and talking, but if you are, we can't hear. I guess I'd be curious in people's thoughts about, in terms of a little self-reflection on our office, things that people feel like went well, in terms of the ARPA project selection process, areas where you think things could have been streamlined or improved. We hope to kind of iteratively improve across the rounds of BEAD and across and learn from the ARPA program. Our office, it's a lot of very new people. We're trying to figure this all out. So we'd appreciate any feedback that people have on that experience.
Adam, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay,
You're a
great.
little faint. Oh, yeah, that's good.
Okay. Hey, this is Corey Tim Menzel with Como. You had made reference to maybe some different alternatives you guys had to funding projects. You had mentioned one based on geography, and I think it kind of plays into what you guys were just discussing. How would that work in theory? Because what you described is a real issue, and I'm just curious how that might look in that in that situation?
So I guess as I understand it, and as NTIA suggests, my understanding is what NTIA is thinking of when they say you could bid out for counties, for instance. And county might be a very big scale to do this on, but they do what counties is one of the geographies they mention, and then they go down to census blocks. Be something like, say, we think that this many unserved locations in this county, we're asking for bids to serve all the unserved locations in this county. Or census block, or can go up and down the levels of geography to get to one you're satisfied with. And so the advantage I think that NTIA sees in that approach is that, there's a little bit less cherry picking. You can ensure some level of comprehensiveness, but there's less flexibility. It's less in terms of allowing providers to define the projects that they want to receive that makes sense for them. So I think there are disadvantages as well. It's mentioned as a possibility in the NOFO, so I wanted to air it here. Be interested in people's thoughts if that would be particularly challenging, or if they think it's helpful in terms of solving this problem.
Adam, this is Andrew with Show Me again. I would maybe recommend that you guys look at the way USDA has structured their grants, because they attempt to solve that problem by allowing the provider to submit projects that would be 90% unserved. And those particular projects can receive more funding than a project that is 50% unserved. So they certainly understand that, and I think it's something that would be a good review for you all.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I guess on the sort of set of requirements and criteria that we talked about, are there particular areas that people think additional support from us would be helpful? Additional conversations with NTIA to try to look for opportunities for flexibility would be helpful. I'd just like to get a sense of the sensitivities in particular areas, and we can try to address those. I guess I'd maybe like to specifically ask about this question of cybersecurity, supply chain. Is that something people have had a chance to look at? That's something people feel confident about, have questions about? Because those are questions we can try to get answers to. And of course, our doors are open. We're happy to get communication from people about any of these issues. And we can try to address concerns that people have. The sort of last section we had here is, once projects are underway, just some quick information. Our thought would be, depending on the timeline, we could end up with potentially some BEAD grants going out around the end of this calendar year, early next calendar year. We are aware that's not exactly a great time to be preparing submissions. So the thought would be to sort of shift the timing going forward and then have sort of annual grant rounds with our remaining 80%. After that point, setting a tempo where projects have some time to get underway, we're able to block off some additional areas that we feel confident that previous BEAD rounds have served, shrinking the set of areas that are remaining, so that we can kind of be responsive to the resources we have left, and the goals of the program and the progress that we've made so far. I also, I wanted to give, we obviously sort of touched on this at the beginning of the program. I did also want to touch on, if all goes according to plan, we're going to be putting a lot of stress on some of the systems we need to work through to get some of these projects done. So I sort of want to kind of launch into a discussion on these topics, because I think people who actually are working on projects out in the state have a better sense than me about what we can do to kind of, reduce the burden on some of these systems, navigate them well, try to put Missouri in a position to get as much, BEAD work done as everybody's kind of rushing into this area all at once. So I guess, both in terms of projects in general and projects with federal funding for people receiving federal funds in particular. What are the barriers in your experience to kind of getting projects underway, to getting projects done? What are areas where we should focus our efforts? And as you can see here, yes, accelerate, make ready approvals. And I guess I would sort of wonder on that point in terms of make ready, if people have had successes, particular approaches that they think have been helpful. If there's a, yes, accelerated, make ready. I guess I'd also ask, before we just open it up for questions in general, if there are things, and also looking into that question, are there things that we can do, that other actors in local or state government can do to help with any of these areas, to accelerate the process? David, if you want to, I think I saw you first.
Yeah, one thing I would say is I think it would help if the state could have some conversations with railroads. We continue to have issues with getting timely permit approvals from railroads. For instance, here in Arkansas, we have one that we've been waiting on now for 18 months. So I think any conversations you could have with them would be helpful. Another obstacle for us in trying to complete projects in a timely manner have really been the rural water associations. A lot of their lines are old and do not include tracer wire. And so that's been something we've had to work through regarding that.
I appreciate that. That's good notes and good people for us to get in touch with.
Adam, I would echo that in terms of Union Pacific, very specifically. There's also quite a high cost associated with those. It's like a review cost for just submitting, and then they hit you with a pretty high cost just for the permit. So yes, that conversation, legislation cleared the path for state roadways, and it seems like something would fit similarly for this railroad domination, that they extend from the center of the earth to wherever the sky ends.
Adam, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, this is Jared Pollock with Charter Communications. One barrier for entry for us, we found some of these RDOF projects, is just getting a reasonable pole attachment agreement with certain entities. There's not a lot of incentive to come to the table and have a meeting of the minds, or even in some situations have a conversation about differences and concerns with an agreement. So we have found a significant hindrance for us on a going forward basis, and a concern with BEAD funding as more funding comes down, particularly in these very, very rural areas.
I appreciate that note as well, and that's something that we can look at. I'll sort of open it up about anything that we discussed today. If people have any questions, obviously we can also circle back to other points of concern on this particular issue as well.
Adam, we did have a couple questions in the chat, so this may allow for others to think of any other questions that they may have, and feel free to come off unmute like you guys have been doing, but also feel free to throw them in the chat there too. And one question we did have is outside of handing out BEAD funds to the service providers, is the state allocating any resources to accelerate deployment that service providers should be aware of, such as rights of way, access to land, rooftops, infrastructure?
So I don't think we have anything that we can announce on that point. But it is something that we're encouraged to look at in terms of our BEAD plans. And so that would be firmed up in our submissions to NTIA. It's a good question.
And we did have another comment in the chat just regarding performance bonds, so we'll take note of that as well. One other thing I do want to throw out there as well is something for you guys as providers to be thinking about too, and some feedback that we'll be looking on getting from you guys. There's a lot of awarded projects going on in the state, whether that's through state funds or federal funds, and we need to figure out how we balance the completion of those projects as well as what we need to put into our guidelines and scoring efforts for our first round of BEAD funding to make sure, that there's a backlog of work there. So, for providers that already have several awarded areas that may score well for a round of BEAD funding, but we know other providers can start on that, sooner than later too. We need to find out what that balance is between awarding those points and writing up that guidance within our guidelines too. So something for you guys as providers to be thinking about. If you have any thoughts right now, we would welcome that as well. But just know that's something that we will also be trying to include within our first round of BEAD funding guidelines and scoring. Do we have any other questions?
Adam, this is Gigi again with Cooper County. The only thing that's a little confusing to me is when I look at those maps, I see there's like some no rhyme or reason. You'll see someone served that's just outside a municipality, yet the municipality is not served. And I'm not just seeing that in one area. So I didn't know if there's any plan of attack here, or I know it's competition within the industry and maybe but is there any way they can, I know they can't share sometimes where they're going and stuff, but when I look at that map, it just seems kind of sporadic to me. And I didn't know if you guys have guidelines for a plan or they submit a plan, but just trying to understand that process of why some areas are served and some aren't, or some individuals served and someone's not. So just.
And I guess I think what you point out there is a very good it's a very good point. I think it may sort of reflect the kind of the picture that we see in this first slide here. At least I think the most typical version of that situation is when you have eligible areas in a town and ineligible areas all around it are, grant programs that have generally been targeted at very rural areas, have sometimes sort of parceled out the rural areas outside of a town, and there has not been a grant commitment within the town for whatever reason. And under BEAD, presumably some of these towns would make very nice kind of compact little projects. But we'll be, as we discussed, we'll be deciding exactly how we bid out these projects. And but I think that is kind of that's a more typical dynamic. But there are all sorts of strange reporting patterns you see across the state that I think we'll just have to kind of kick the tires on through our state challenge process and try to get some sense of what's going on in different areas.
Thank you.
And I did want to prompt people. We'll keep this up for a little while, but this survey is mostly asking how we did, and then just a few questions kind of following up on some of the topics we covered today. Appreciate if people have a second to take that survey. It is helpful for us to kind of document what we've been up to.
Great, thank you, Adam. Just one more thing I do want to touch on before everyone jumps off here. Just a preview as far as what to expect here in the next coming month or so. We are looking at doing our follow-up in-person informational meetings at the end of May. So the last 3 weeks of May, we are looking at going back around to the 19 different regions with the regional planning commissions hosting us to be able to present out on information for the BEAD program, the Digital Equity Act, what our plans do look like. The University of Missouri plans on presenting on where they are at with their deliverables that they are working on through a partnership with us for these IIJA efforts and many other things. So we definitely want to make sure that you guys book that on your calendars. Do expect to see some more information coming out about what that schedule does look like, and more information for an agenda and questions we'll be looking to get answered at the beginning of next week. So you guys can go to our Connecting All Missourians webpage, which is ded.mo.gov/getconnected. And that information will all be on there. We will also be sending out some email correspondence. So if you're not already signed up for our broadband emails, feel free feel free to do so as well. So that way you guys can stay up to date with all of the latest correspondence from our office. I think that is what we had for you guys today. We appreciate everyone jumping on and providing that feedback. We'll definitely take that into consideration. And as Adam said, please take that survey for us. And if there are any final follow-up questions, we'll feel free to answer those. Otherwise, feel free to jump off and enjoy the rest of your day.